Have you ever stopped to wonder what is it that truly makes a family? Is it the bloodline we're born into? The names on cold pieces of paper? Or is it something deeper, something formed through years of storms, love, and sacrifice? The story you are about to hear is no fairy tale. It's a raw piece of life. One where a single question is powerful enough to shatter 18 years of peace. Who are the real parents? What follows is a journey through choice, sacrifice, and a profound truth. The one who gives you life may give you your body, but the one who raises you is the one who gives you your soul. And before we begin, if this story touches your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Every comment is a reminder that family isn't defined by blood, but built on love, choice, and bonds that distance can never break. Now, let us begin. On the quiet, windswept shores of Lake Michigan, tucked away in the little village of Hay, lived an old man named Samuel. His wooden house stood only steps away from the frozen lake, a place where winter storms roared so fiercely that even the walls of his home groaned against the wind. To Samuel, the lake wasn't just water. It was a living companion, sometimes a giver of life, sometimes a stern and unforgiving judge. He had been born here, the son and grandson of fishermen. Though he once left to serve up north and glimpsed the wider world, he always knew he would return to this shore. And he did, though life was not kind to him. After losing both his wife and only son, Samuel remained alone. The villagers respected him not for words, he was a man of few, but for the strength in his weathered hands, the quiet kindness in his eyes, and the way his gaze seemed to hold the shifting colors of sky and water. One frigid January morning, when the air burned at just 20 degrees, Samuel rose before dawn. He prepared, as he always did, to head out onto the ice. The kettle steamed on the stove. His old mittens lay ready. The sled was loaded, the auger sharpened, wrapped in layers against the cold. He walked toward his weather-worn boat, pulled ashore long ago and now serving as a shed. But when he opened the door, he froze. Inside, among nets, ropes, and empty buckets, were two small bundles. At first, he thought someone had left bags behind. But then one of the bundles moved. With trembling hands, Samuel pulled back the blanket. A baby girl, her cheeks rosy from the cold, her tiny fists clenched. Beside her, a boy older, with wide, alert eyes that seemed to take in everything. Both were wrapped snugly in woolen blankets. The girl's face peeked out softly. The boy moved his lips as though whispering to the world. Samuel blinked. Was he dreaming? Had grief finally taken his senses? But no, the babies were breathing. Alive. There was no note, no basket, no tracks in the snow. The storm had erased all signs, leaving behind only silence. He turned, staring out at the trees and distant houses, but nothing stirred. It was as if the lake itself had placed these children in his care. He asked no questions. He had no doubts. With arms that had once cradled his own son, Samuel gathered the babies, holding them close, feeling their tiny bodies shivering against him. He carried them into his home, set them gently on his bed, stoked the fire high, and warmed some milk. He moved without hesitation, almost as though his heart had been waiting for this moment all along. Some might ask, why didn't the old man call the police? But when life has taken everything from you, and suddenly places two fragile reasons to live back into your arms, you don't question. The heart often knows truths the law cannot. Days turned into weeks. The children did not fall ill. Instead, they grew stronger. The little girl began to smile often, while the boy watched his surroundings with quiet intensity, his gaze thoughtful and searching. Samuel named them Grace and Steve. He had no way of knowing their real names, and perhaps he didn't want to. To him, a new life had begun on that icy morning. At first, The villagers of Havenwood were suspicious. Whispers spread. Some wondered if Samuel was hiding something. A few even suggested the sheriff should be called, but when confronted, Samuel only said, "They're mine now." He offered no explanations. And in Havenwood, people still lived by what they saw in your eyes, not what was written on paper. They saw the children alive, warm, and cared for. They saw Samuel, once hollow with grief, now walking with purpose. And so, though they shook their heads in disbelief, they left him be. Because in places like Havenwood, family isn't proved with documents. It's shown in the way a man carries a child in his arms, or how a fire burns brighter in a lonely home because laughter has returned to it. For Samuel, that cold January morning was not the end of his solitude. It was the beginning of his family. Perhaps, in what others called madness, Samuel had uncovered a truth the modern world had long forgotten: that love and loyalty matter more than blood or papers. Once he chose those children as his own, there was no room left for doubt. And so, their journey as a family began. Winter loosened its grip, leaving behind muddy, half-frozen roads and skies heavy with clouds. With the spring thaw came new life. Samuel built a wooden swing in front of the house, tying its ropes firmly to an old pine. He watched with quiet joy as the little ones shrieked in laughter, their boots kicking up dirt as they soared back and forth. When summer arrived, he carried them to the lake first, cradled in baskets, then held close in his arms. The years flowed like the river into the lake. Grace grew wild and spirited, her laugh ringing out stubborn and loud. Steve was her opposite, thoughtful, content to sit by the water, tossing stones and watching ripples spread into the horizon. By the time they reached their teenage years, Steve had become steady and contemplative, so, much like Samuel himself, Grace remained a fire-curious, outspoken, and fearless. What they shared was a boundless love for the man they called Grandpa. But love cannot silence questions forever. On her 16th birthday, Grace looked Samuel straight in the eye and asked, "Grandpa, is it true you found us in a boat?" Samuel, who had always met the world with silence, nodded once. That silence weighed heavier than words. From that day, the truth of their beginnings settled deep in their hearts, a quiet ache that grew stronger with time. Samuel felt it, their searching eyes, their unspoken doubt. He feared the truth might crack apart the fragile home he had built. That night, sleep refused him. Do you know the feeling of walking across thin ice? Every step is cautious, every breath careful, praying the frozen surface will hold. That was how Samuel had lived all these years, knowing that one fracture from the past could sink everything. On sleepless nights, Samuel would open an old chest. Inside lay the blankets that had once held the babies, and a small wooden cross marked with the initials R and N. It had fallen from Steve's blanket that long ago morning. Samuel kept it not as a secret, but as a sacred token, a reminder that life had granted him a miracle. When grief had left him hollow, to Samuel, family was not about where you came from, but about what you build together. Yet he knew someday that answer might not be enough for them. Still, joy filled his days. He lived for their laughter outside the window, their footsteps on the porch, the way one of them would call, "Grandpa, we're here." He hadn't simply found children. He had found a family that gave him back his will to live. Nothing suggested that a storm was on its way. On the morning of their 18th birthday, Samuel felt peace. It had been 18 years since he found them, and not once had he regretted his choice. Steve worked quietly on the fishing nets, while Grace hummed in the kitchen, making blackberry jam. To Samuel, they were his greatest blessing. But peace is a fragile thing. That morning, Steve went to fetch the mail. On the railing sat a thick envelope. No stamp, no address. He opened it, expecting nothing more than a forgotten bill. Instead, one handwritten line in dark blue ink froze him where he stood. "They are ours. And we are coming back." 18 years of peace, destroyed by a single sentence. The fortress Samuel had built for his family had cracked. Steve carried the letter inside, and placed it silently in Samuel's hands. The old man read it once. Then again. The paper shook in his fingers. He sank onto a stool, his shoulders collapsing under the sudden weight of years. Grace grabbed the letter and read it. The room fell silent. Only the clock ticking and the stove's faint crackle broke the stillness. "Who are they?" Grace asked. Her voice was calm, almost cold. Samuel stared at the floor. For the first time, Grace saw him not only as old, but as weary, fragile in a way he had never seemed before. "You know who it is," Steve said softly. "Otherwise, you wouldn't look like this." Samuel lifted his head, lips trembling. Finally, in a whisper heavier than thunder, he said, "I don't know for certain, but I suspect." The words struck like a hammer. Grace's eyes blazed, not with anger, but with fierce resolve. She asked nothing more, for now, but she knew the truth had never felt so close, and she would not let it slip away. The day passed under the shadow of that letter. No one touched their food. Samuel sat at the window, puffing his pipe, staring into nothing. Grace paced restlessly, her heart a storm. Steve kept himself busy, though his mind circled endlessly. Who are these people? Why now? After all these years? Night fell. The sky darkened to violet. The lake reflected the fading light like glass. Grace approached Samuel once more. Her voice trembled with strength and sorrow. "If you know something," she said, "tell me. Not because I demand it. Not because I'm afraid, but because I am your granddaughter. Or at least I thought I was." Samuel's face softened into grief. He sighed, carrying the weight of a lifetime in his breath. "When I found you," he began, "I was searching for answers too. But there were none. No tracks. No letters. Only the blankets. And this little cross." His hand shook as he gestured toward the token. "I didn't tell anyone. I feared they would take you away. And I could not have survived it." His voice cracked with every word. "The years passed. No one came. I thought they were gone, or had abandoned you. And now," he nodded toward the letter, "here it is." Grace didn't judge him, but in that moment, she saw something she had never seen before. The truth that their love, their home, their small world, was not safe from the past. Outside, the wind rose. Clouds smothered the stars. Even the village dogs, usually restless, lay silent. A storm was coming. A week passed after the letter arrived. And though life moved forward, a strange tension lingered in the air. On that particular day, everything seemed almost too calm. The sun shone brighter than usual. The sky stretched out in flawless blue, and the little town felt deserted, as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then it came. At first, Samuel thought he imagined it. A low, droning sound, like a plane flying too close to the ground. He was sitting quietly in the yard, mending an old fishing rod, when the sound grew deeper, stronger, until it echoed through the trees. His chest tightened. A white SUV appeared over the hill, sleek and polished, like a drop of oil rolling across fresh snow. The license plates glinted in the sun. Washington, D.C. The car stopped neatly at his gate. A man stepped out first, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. His movements carried the confidence of someone used to command. Then, a woman emerged. She wore a gray trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, her face cold and unreadable. Together, they seemed out of place in this quiet corner of the world. Strangers who didn't belong among small houses, weathered fences, and neighbors who knew each other by name. Samuel rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The way it had long ago, when he first enlisted in the army. He didn't know their faces, but something in him already knew who they were. The man walked forward, removed his gloves, and gave a slight nod. "Are you Samuel?" he asked. His voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Samuel gave a small nod. The woman's gaze swept over the yard, the old sled leaning against the wall, the worn boards of the porch. She didn't say a word, but Samuel could read her eyes. This place was beneath her. The man extended his hand slightly. My name is Richard Anderson. This is my wife, Victoria Roberts. We've come from Washington, D.C. We need to talk to you. About Steve and Grace. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the porch and said simply, "Come in." Inside, the house was quiet. Grace and Steve were still down by the lake, unaware of the storm walking into their home. Only the cat lay curled near the stove, lifting its head lazily at the strangers before settling back down. Richard removed his coat carefully, draping it across a chair before sitting down. Victoria remained standing stiff, as though she couldn't bear to touch anything in the room. Richard's voice was calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. "We know you found them 18 years ago," he began. "At the time, things were complicated. We couldn't keep them. My father held an important political position. There were threats, real ones. We were young, terrified. We made a desperate choice." He looked away for a moment, as though the memory weighed heavy on him, then fixed his gaze back on Samuel. "Leaving them in that boat. I know how it sounds, but we made sure they'd be found. We knew you would take care of them. We chose you." Samuel clenched his fists. Their words pierced him like thorns. They spoke of the children not as people, not as souls he had raised, but as possessions that could be reclaimed once the danger had passed. "And now," he said, his voice cracking with restrained fury, "now you come for what?" Victoria spoke for the first time. Her tone was cool, almost mechanical. "We want them back," she said. "We can prove who we are. We have documents, DNA, and witnesses. We don't want a scandal. But these are our children. It's time they came home to Washington." Samuel stood slowly. His movements were heavy and deliberate. He walked to the stove and picked up the poker. He placed another log on the fire. He didn't look at them as he spoke. His voice was soft, but sharp as steel. "You speak of laws. You speak of rights. But I hear nothing in your voices that sounds like love. Love doesn't leave a baby on a frozen lake in the middle of the night. Love doesn't vanish for 18 years. And love doesn't return only with papers in hand." He turned toward them, eyes blazing. "You think they're suitcases, ready to be claimed after all this time? Do you think family works like baggage at an airport?" Richard rose, steady but tense. "We understand your attachment," he said, "but you are not their family. Not legally. Perhaps emotionally, yes. But that's not enough. They deserve to know who they are, and we demand that you not stand in the way." Samuel stepped forward. His voice was a low growl of pain and defiance. "You didn't care for 18 years, he said. "You didn't search. You didn't whisper their names. And now you return, thinking a stack of papers makes you parents again. Family is not something you sign for. It's something you live for." Victoria opened her bag slowly. She pulled out a file and placed it neatly on the table. "Here is everything you need," she said. "Proof, documents, a future we can offer them. Education, opportunities, everything they cannot have here. We will give them a choice." At that very moment, the door creaked. Steve and Grace stepped inside. They hadn't heard everything, but they saw the strangers sitting in their home. Strangers who looked at them with unsettling familiarity. Richard's eyes softened as he looked at them. Victoria forced a smile polished and hollow, the kind of smile you'd see in a magazine ad. "Steve, Grace," Richard said gently, "we are your parents." The words landed like a thunderclap. The air in the room froze. For Steve and Grace, the world shifted in an instant. Everything they thought they knew trembled. It was as if the ground beneath them had cracked wide open. This was no longer just a conversation. It was the beginning of a battle where love and bloodline would collide, where memory and truth stood on opposite sides. A silence fell so heavy, even the fire stopped crackling. Steve stepped forward instinctively. He placed himself slightly in front of Grace, as if shielding her from the storm about to break. Grace's eyes lingered on Samuel. She didn't need words. Her silence spoke volumes. And so began a new chapter. One where the past returned not with apologies, but with demands, where love was no longer measured in years of sacrifice, but in stamped documents and polished arguments. Everything Samuel had built, the trust, the warmth, the devotion, now trembled under the weight of legal claims and the ambitions of strangers. The house was silent long after Richard and Victoria left. No tears, no shouts. Just the stillness that follows after a storm has passed. Dust hung in the air. Steve and Grace sat across from Samuel in the kitchen. He looked older, as if 10 years had settled on his shoulders in one afternoon. In his hands, he held the file Richard and Victoria had left. He hadn't opened it. He just clutched it tightly, as though sheer strength could erase whatever truths those pages held. It was Steve who finally spoke. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "The first thing we have to do is listen, Grandpa, not because we believe them, but because we deserve to know." Grace turned away, her arms folded tightly. She stared out the window. Anger and confusion swirled inside her like a storm. For 18 years, she had believed Samuel was her only parent, the one person who never abandoned her. And now, strangers had appeared, claiming, "You are ours." The next morning, Richard and Victoria returned. This time, they didn't wait for an invitation. They entered the house as though it already belonged to them. Richard's confidence remained, though his eyes carried more caution than before. Victoria stayed cold, gloves still on her hands, as if she couldn't bear to touch the place. Richard began, calm but firm. "We know this is a shock. We don't expect you to take our word alone. We've brought proof birth certificates, DNA results, official documents. This isn't about doubt anymore. It's only a matter of time." Samuel didn't answer. His eyes seemed far away, as though his spirit had stepped out of the room to escape what was unfolding. Steve leaned forward slightly. "We don't deny the obvious," he said quietly, "but there's a difference between biology and a life lived." For the first time, Victoria's mask cracked. She gave a faint, sarcastic smile. "You call this a life," she said. "A forgotten town at the edge of nowhere. No future. No opportunities. We're offering Washington, D.C.'s the best schools, real careers, the future you deserve. We didn't come to take you back. We came to claim what is ours." Grace's head snapped around. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Yours," she shouted. "We are not objects, not cars, not books you left behind. We were abandoned like forgotten bags. And now 18 years later, you appear to collect what you think belongs to you." Richard let out a heavy sigh. "Because we are no longer afraid. 18 years ago, my work put us in danger. Powerful people would have used you against us. Leaving you was the only way we knew to protect you. Yes, it was a mistake, but it was fear that drove it." Grace's voice trembled. "And now that the fear is gone, you simply walk back in and declare yourselves our parents." Richard's tone softened. "My father is dead. With him, the threats disappeared. Only guilt remains. We searched for you as soon as it was safe. Before, it was impossible. Now we can." Steve, who had been silent, finally stood. He walked toward the stove, then turned to face them. "Convenient, isn't it?" he said. "When the danger is gone, when your lives are neat and ordered, Suddenly, it's the right time to be parents. But we don't know you. We never did. All we had was him. He nodded at Samuel, and that was enough. Victoria rose to her feet, her voice sharper now. You have to at least try. We're not asking you to forget him, but we are your parents. We can give you more. That's the truth. Samuel finally lifted his head. His voice was low, rough, and full of pain. More. What is more? Money, a name in the city. I gave them love. I gave them honesty, respect, a life built on work and decency. And you, what exactly do you offer? Richard hesitated. He looked to Victoria. She gave a small, approving nod. Opportunities, he said firmly. Possibilities you can't provide. You know it's true, Samuel. You're getting old. How much longer can you care for them? Let them decide for themselves. Don't hold them back. And that was when Samuel broke. Slowly, painfully, he stood. Every movement looked like it cost him. He went to the door, opened it wide, and without turning, said only, "Go. Leave them the space to think without you hovering." Richard opened his mouth to protest. But Victoria placed a hand on his arm. Together, they left. The door closed behind them with a slam. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock. Then Steve walked over to Samuel. He laid a steady hand on his shoulder and whispered, "We're not leaving. This is our life, not theirs." Grace sat beside Samuel, wrapping her arms around him. She wasn't crying, but her eyes carried a sorrow that had been building for years. Slow, heavy, and unshakable. The truth of the past wasn't a fairy tale or a legend. It was a cold, gray reality built on fear and decisions made long ago. Now, the choice lay before them. Return to that past, or remain in the present life Samuel had built through love and sacrifice. A week passed since Richard and Victoria arrived in heaven. Their presence lingered, even when they weren't at the house. In a small town, news travels fast. Soon, everyone knew who they were and why they had come. Some pitied Samuel. Others worried for Steve and Grace, quietly wondering if blood ties would outweigh 18 years of devotion. Richard and Victoria stayed at a hotel outside town, but every day they appeared at Samuel's gate, waiting silently, as if time itself would bend to their demands. Samuel grew frail. He hardly ate, barely slept. He seemed to shrink into himself. The once strong man now looked like a tree hollowed by years of strain, still standing, but breaking inside. Steve grew quiet. He spent long hours by the lake in silence, searching for answers in the still water. Grace, restless and fiery, confronted the intruders again and again. She pushed her brother to take a stand. Though her storm of anger left her no peace, her voice was calm, almost cold. On the 8th day, Richard arrived with a lawyer. Victoria soon followed. Without asking, they entered the house. Victoria, cold as ever, began filming the rooms, and even Samuel himself. The lawyer spread his documents across the table. "We're not here to threaten," he said. "We're here to restore what is rightfully theirs. We have birth certificates, DNA results. By law, custody can be reclaimed. If the children agree, you cannot hold them back." The words struck Samuel like a blow. His hands trembled. His voice broke as he whispered, "Take them, like baggage to be claimed." Richard stepped forward. "We don't want conflict," he said, "but they are our children. They deserve Washington, education, opportunity. There's no future for them here, and me." Samuel's voice cracked. 18 years of raising them of fear, of joy, does none of it matter? The lawyer's expression didn't change. "We acknowledge your role, but the law doesn't weigh emotions. If they choose, you must step aside. Once transferred, you will cut all contact. That is our demand." Victoria added sharply, "He is nothing. Psychologically, Legally, nothing. Just a temporary figure. Grace couldn't bear it. She stepped forward, trembling with fury. No, she shouted. He is not temporary. He is the one who stayed. The one who raised us when you vanished. He's our real family. Richard's voice softened but remained firm. We understand your pain. But this isn't about emotions. You're grown now. The choice is yours. We offer money, security, and opportunity. The rest is up to you. Steve shook his head firmly. I already know who I am, he said. I grew up here. I'm not a product of some Washington apartment. Or your comfortable silence. Samuel pushed himself up, leaning on the chair. His body was weary. But his voice carried new strength. I can't forbid you from leaving. I can't force you to stay. But if you go, he looked at Steve and Grace. Know this. My door will always be open. And forget anyone who dares call you objects. You don't belong to them. You belong to yourselves. Everything you are. You became on your own. Victoria snapped her file shut. Her tone was sharp. We'll be back tomorrow, she said. We expect an answer. Otherwise, we'll pursue this through court. They left. Their absence made the house colder than before. Silence spread across the rooms. Steve walked over and hugged his grandfather without a word. Grace stood at the window. Her face hard, her heart filled with fury and resolve. That night stretched endlessly. For the first time, their family, built not on blood, but on love, choice, and daily devotion, stood on the edge of being torn apart. Not by death or disaster, but by a demand as legal as it was soulless. Morning came early. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows into the house. Familiar sounds filled the air. The creak of the floorboards, the crackle of the stove, the lapping water outside. But none of it brought comfort. A heavy unease hung in the air. At the kitchen table, Steve and Grace sat staring at the folder of documents left behind. Samuel kept his eyes on them but said nothing. As always, he waited. Finally, Steve broke the silence. His voice was calm but heavy. Each word a weight. We have to think, he said. Not because we want to leave, but because we can't pretend none of this matters. Our lives have already changed whether we want it or not. Grace kept gazing out the window. Her voice was quiet. Do you think they really have something we don't? Steve didn't answer right away. He lifted a cup to his lips but didn't drink. Maybe, he said softly, a city, a university, a future we've only read about. Maybe there's another world out there, and maybe we should see it. Grace spun toward him, her eyes blazing. Seeing isn't leaving, she cried. They want us to forget who we are, to erase our life with Grandpa. That's not moving forward. That's betrayal. Samuel laid a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm and deep. It's not betrayal, Grace. It's a decision. And it must be yours. I've done what I could. The rest is up to you. Grace looked at him desperately. And you'll just let us go? He smiled sadly. The kind of smile only life's hardships can carve into a man. If that's what it takes, yes, I won't stop you. I'll be here for as long as I can. Steve lowered his head, torn apart inside. He never dreamed of luxury. But books, knowledge, and stories had always fascinated him. Now, the chance to see beyond the small town was real. But the cost was far greater than he imagined. Grace went to the window. The white SUV was parked outside again. Richard and Victoria waited calmly. Like hunters, certain their prey would come willingly. I'm not going, she said firmly. They mean nothing to me. Blood doesn't make family. I'm staying. Steve didn't answer. He walked to Samuel, hugged him tightly, then sat back down. I don't want to leave you, he said softly. But I need to understand who I am. Maybe it's foolish. Maybe I'll regret it. But I can't live without knowing. Samuel nodded quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply accepted. Grace turned to her brother, anger and sorrow mixing in her voice. You think you'll find yourself with people who show up with lawyers and papers, treating us like some business project? Steve's reply was soft. The truth is always moving. I have to try. But I'll never stop being your brother. And I'll never stop loving our grandfather. I just need to do this. Tears spilled from Grace's eyes. She didn't wipe them away. Then go, she said quietly. But don't expect me to wait for you. If you change your mind. Her words were sharp. But Samuel understood. It was her way of protecting herself. Masking unbearable pain with anger. Steve didn't defend himself. He didn't blame her. He just knew there was no other path. An hour later, he left. Richard opened the SUV door. Steve climbed in without looking back. It was the most painful moment. When a family breaks. Not from hatred, but from one haunting question. Who am I? Samuel didn't stop him. He knew sometimes you must leave home to understand what home really means. But whether Steve would find his answer, or a harsher truth, only time would tell. Grace trembled on the porch. Samuel wrapped his arms around her. His hands were cold, but his embrace carried a warmth she would never forget. How can you cage a bird that longs to fly? He whispered softly. True love is not a cage, Grace. It's the open sky. The SUV disappeared around the bend. Silence returned by the lake. But it wasn't the same silence. It was the silence after something breaks. The silence of choice. Of a heart that shatters, but does not yield. For Samuel and Grace, the house felt emptier. The laughter, the rhythm of daily life, the little rituals, they were cut in half. Even the sounds changed. Grace's footsteps echoed louder. The spaces between the clock's ticks grew heavier. Samuel moved slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that remained. Grace still rose early, fed the chickens, lit the stove, did the chores, but without spirit. Once, her actions carried life and determination. Now they were mechanical, hollow, weighed down by grief. She wasn't angry with Samuel, just lost. She couldn't find words for the pain inside her. Steve hadn't called. He hadn't written. The silence of his absence filled every corner of the house. Grace checked the mailbox every single day, always at the same hour, as if her brother's handwriting might finally appear. Each time, her heart beat fast with hope, and each time, the box was empty. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Every morning carried the fragile promise of news, and every evening ended with quiet disappointment. One afternoon, her hand shook so badly that she dropped a cup. The shattering sound echoed her own breaking heart. Samuel didn't scold her. He didn't even speak. Sometimes he sat quietly beside her, offering nothing but his presence and the steady warmth of the stove. Other times, he walked down to the shore, pretending to check his nets. He carried his own grief too, though he bore it in silence. Losing Steve hadn't just left a gap in the house, it had taken a piece of Samuel himself. Yet he knew. Youth had battles no one else could fight, and silences that only time could answer. 3 months after Steve left, a whisper spread through a neighbor said she'd seen him on television. A charity event in Washington. A young man reunited with his biological parents. After years of separation, Grace hadn't seen the report, but the news cut through her like a blade. To hear of her brother like that, as though his life in Havenwood had never existed, was unbearable. Samuel heard soon after. He didn't respond. But that night, he didn't go to bed. He sat by the window with his pipe, staring into the darkness, as though waiting for Steve to appear. the way he once had after late fishing trips. But the yard remained empty. The night offered only the whisper of wind and scattered stars. Not long after, official letters arrived. Richard and Victoria had begun the legal process of reclaiming their parental rights. Samuel received a formal notice, its language cold and precise. He read it the way one reads someone else's dream. Distant, foreign, impossible to protest. He had no desire to fight in court. He knew the law, with its documents and definitions, would never acknowledge 18 years of devotion. His only hope was that Steve would come back by his own choice, not through paperwork, not through force. Grace's heart hardened. It wasn't just anger at her brother, it was the entire situation. She blamed herself for not stopping him, for not saying enough, for not clinging to him that last morning. His departure wasn't just distance. It felt like betrayal. Like their bond had been torn apart. In her mind, if he ever returned, things could never be the same. One late afternoon, Grace came home from the library and found an envelope on the table. No stamp. No return address. Just like the letter that had started everything. Her chest tightened. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were only 3 lines, written in Steve's familiar handwriting, tilted slightly to the right. Grace, I'm sorry. I don't know who I am anymore. But every night when I close my eyes, I see you. I haven't forgotten. The note struck her like a shot. She crushed it in her fist, then smoothed it flat again. Unable to let go. Tears didn't come, but something inside her cracked. Not from sorrow this time, but because hope had been reignited, fragile and thin like spring ice. That evening, Samuel found her outside near the shed, clutching the letter, her eyes fixed on the stars. She whispered, "He hasn't forgotten." Samuel simply nodded. He had known, even on the day Steve left. He had known, each night when he thought he heard footsteps in the yard, phantom echoes of the boy he raised. He had known, in the way silence felt heavier in the house, Steve's heart still carried the flame of home. But until he returned, they would remain suspended, half the house in shadow, half a family waiting. The unspoken question lingered in the air, woven into the very timbers of their home. Will he come back? Grace changed after that letter. She wasn't healed, not yet. But something inside her began to stir again. It wasn't forgiveness, not even trust, but a tiny breath of life, like ice beginning to crack under spring sunlight. Still, the questions gnawed at her. If he remembered, if he still cared. Why the silence? Why wasn't he fighting to come back? Life in Havenwood carried on, outwardly unchanged. Grace helped at the library again. She stayed close to Samuel. She noticed he was weakening. He no longer ventured out on the lake. Breathing came harder in the mornings. He spent hours by the window, wrapped in a blanket. He watched the world outside as though preparing to say goodbye. One day in the store, Grace ran into the same woman. She had told Grace about Steve's TV appearance before. This time, the woman carried a magazine. Flipping to a page, she showed Grace a glossy photograph. Steve stood in a suit before a grand building. The caption declared him the son of Richard Anderson, former political figure. He was now preparing to join a youth initiative at City Hall. Grace's hands shook as she held the magazine. The face was unmistakably Steve's, but the light in his eyes was gone. His expression was flat. His smile was strained. His gaze was unfocused, as though trapped behind glass. When she returned home, she read his short letter again. I don't know who I am. Now it sounded like a cry for help. She knew she could no longer wait in silence. She had to see for herself. That night, she opened her grandfather's old laptop and searched. Article after article appeared, glossy photos, smiling headlines about the miraculous reunion. But nowhere was there mention of Samuel. Not one word about the man who had raised him. Who had sat by his bedside through fevers. Who had worked and sacrificed for 18 years. It was as though those years had been erased. Then she read a line in one interview with Michael. "We fought for years to stay silent, to protect our family's honor. Now we can finally prove we've always been united." She read it again and again. The words were not about love, guilt, or reconciliation. They were about strategy, about preserving reputation. Steve wasn't being embraced as a son. He was being used as a symbol. A polished story to serve someone else's ambition. The realization solidified something in her heart. This wasn't family. This was politics, and Steve was caught in it. The very next day, Grace packed a small bag. Without telling Samuel, she boarded a train to Chicago. Then a bus bound for Washington. She left only a note on the table. "I'll be back. I need to understand." The city overwhelmed her. Noise, lights, strangers everywhere. It felt like stepping into a different world. But determination pushed her forward. She knew where to go. The media had made Richard Anderson's home well known. The mansion rose behind tall gates. Cameras watched every corner. Guards were stationed at the entrance. Grace stood outside, unsure of her next step. Knock, shout, demand. She didn't need to. Half an hour later, Steve emerged. He carried a suitcase in his hand. A coat was slung over his shoulder. Their eyes met, and he froze. Slowly, as if afraid she might vanish, he walked toward her. "What are you doing here?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I found you," she said, "and I saw it you're not free here. They're using you." Steve's shoulders sagged. His face was pale. His expression was weary. "I thought I could matter to them. I thought they needed me. But I was wrong. I'm not their Sunnim, just another piece in their plan. You're not an image. And you're not some token for their world," Grace told him softly. "You're my brother. The one who belongs with us back home, with Grandpa." Steve's eyes brimmed with tears. He nodded. Whispering, he said, "I wanted to write so many times, but I was terrified I'd gone too far, that I'd broken something beyond repair." "There's always a way back," Grace replied. Her voice was steady. "As long as we don't forget who we really are." That night, they sat together on a bench near a noisy metro station. Cars hissed past. Strangers brushed against them without a second glance. Yet, in that chaos, the two of them felt like the only souls that mattered. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. And that was enough to remind them of the truth. Family isn't in titles or documents. It's in the choices you make, in who stays beside you when the storms come. When Steve first arrived in Washington, he thought, perhaps with time, he'd settle in. The early days had been intoxicating. New clothes, good food, polite smiles everywhere he turned. Richard paraded him through sleek offices. Speaking of influence, legacy, and the future he could now claim, Victoria filled his days with shopping, appointments, and introductions to people with names that carried weight. Everywhere he went, he heard the same message. You are an heir. You are an Anderson. You are a symbol to be displayed with pride. But the shine wore off quickly. The warmth in those smiles was only every compliment carried the weight of expectation. Behind the lavish gifts and polite lessons. How to sit straight. How to speak in public. How to carry himself like nobility. Steve felt the grip of something cold and suffocating. At night, his room was spotless. Comfortable, but lifeless. Too quiet, too polished, too foreign. He would lie awake, remembering the drafty Heavenwood house with its creaking shutters. The smell of wood smoke. The sound of Lake Michigan against the shore. Poorer, yes. Rougher, yes. But alive. One evening, on his way to fetch a book, Steve overheard voices through a half-open door. Richard and Victoria were speaking in low tones. "He needs to stay visible for another couple of months," Victoria said. "It strengthens the narrative family values, reunion, stability. Just in time for the elections?" "And after that?" Richard asked. "We'll send him abroad. The important thing is to cut him off from that place completely. No ties, no distractions." Steve froze. Their words fell like hammer blows. He wasn't a son. They weren't rebuilding a family. He was an accessory. A piece in a calculated performance. A tool. Nothing more. That night, truth didn't feel like freedom. It felt like chains. The illusion of belonging crumbled in seconds, leaving only raw betrayal. He returned to his room. He lay down fully dressed. He stared at the ceiling until dawn. By morning, he knew what he had to do. Without telling anyone, he left. No speeches. No explanations. Just his passport, some money, and an old photograph. It was him, Grace, and Samuel, sitting by a campfire. Soot on their cheeks, a grilled fish in their hands. That picture was the only map he needed. The trip back to Havenwood was long and heavy. Not because of the road, but because of the questions weighing on him. Would Grace welcome him, or turn her back? Would Samuel still be alive to see him walk through the door? Was there still a home waiting, or had it all slipped away for good? By the time he arrived, night had fallen. Snow fell thick across the fields. He followed the familiar path toward the house. The sight of its small, sagging roof under the weight of winter made his chest tighten. A single light glowed through the frosted window. Everything looked the same, and yet he felt like a stranger at the threshold. He knocked once. Then again. Grace opened the door. For a long moment, they only looked at each other. No words passed, only the flood of emotions neither had dared to hope for. Tears welled in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. She stepped aside. He entered. The scent of wood smoke and fish filled him instantly. It wrapped him in the memory of every day he'd thought he'd lost forever. Samuel was seated by the fire, frail and weary. He didn't rise. He just lifted his gaze. Steve dropped to his knees in front of him, at a loss for words. The old man placed a trembling hand on his grandson's head. "You're home," he said simply. 2 words. Yet inside them lived a lifetime of forgiveness. They washed away the guilt, the shame, and the fear. Grace moved closer. She placed her hand on Steve's. The 3 of them stayed like that, quiet, but bound tighter than any courtroom or paper could make them. The silence wasn't empty. It was healing. Outside, the lake roared beneath the storm. But within those worn walls, peace had returned at last. No more letters came. No more threats. In Washington, the grand story of a lost son, reunited with his powerful family, quickly lost its shine. Once the symbol himself disappeared. Without Steve, the narrative crumbled. Richard and Victoria faded back into silence. Their game was rendered powerless. What remained was small, fragile, ordinary, but it was real. And in the end, that was everything. The family was whole again, though each of them carried scars the world could not see. From the moment Steve stepped back into the small house on the shore of Lake Michigan, something shifted. Time slowed. He moved through the rooms as though rediscovering them for the first time, running his hand across the old table, the cracked floorboard, the nail where Samuel's fishing hat had always hung. Nothing in the house had changed. Yet Steve himself was different. He had returned not just as the boy who once left, but as a young man who knew what it meant to lose everything, and what it cost to find the truth. Samuel didn't question him. He simply lived beside him, the way he always had. Each morning, he stirred oatmeal. He warmed the stove. He placed fish on the table, and let silence speak. At times, he would only nod, as if confirming that life, in its own quiet rhythm, was still moving forward. Grace, though under the same roof, kept her distance. She rarely spoke. And when she did, her words were measured. It wasn't anger that held her back, but a need for time to protect herself until she could trust the air. They all breathed together again. The days passed like half-dreams. Steve often wandered to the edge of the frozen lake, sitting for hours with his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't searching for reasons anymore, only for direction. He knew Washington would not forget him. Michael's men would eventually come knocking with their papers and promises. But Steve no longer feared them. His return was not an escape. It was a reclaiming, not of safety, but of himself. Half a year slipped by. Outside Havenwood, no one knew where he had gone, except Samuel and Grace. They guarded his secret as one guards the last glowing ember in a dying fire. No letters arrived. No more calls came. In Washington, interest had faded as quickly as it had flared. Without Steve standing before the cameras, Richard and Victoria had nothing left to show. Perhaps they found another pawn. Perhaps they simply moved on. For the small town, their games no longer mattered. Havenwood's days settled back into their rhythm. Fishermen returned to the water. Women hung clothes to dry near their stoves. Children chased each other along frozen paths. From the outside, nothing seemed changed. Yet, within Samuel's home, the air felt heavier. No longer weighed down by fear, but not yet carrying the lightness of joy. It was the kind of waiting that comes before spring. Patient, certain, though without a clear date. Grace, too, was changing. Not suddenly, but in slow, steady ways. She carried herself with more weight now. Speaking less, but meaning more with every word. She spent her days helping at the library, writing for the local paper, and running a craft workshop for village girls. People who once called her only Samuel's granddaughter now addressed her with respect. By her own name, she had grown into herself. Yet her greatest concern was Samuel. He was fading. Tasks that once seemed simple now left him weary. He struggled to lift a bucket of water, or take long walks without her arm for support. But the light within him had not dimmed. It was the same steady flame that had carried them all through grief and storms. Evenings often found Grace and her grandfather sitting side by side, books in their laps, or staring together out the window. At times he told her stories, not tales invented to entertain, but memories from his own life. His years of service up north. The woman he had loved. His childhood dreams of guarding wild forests. Grace listened intently, scribbling notes in her notebooks. She wasn't preparing a book. She simply wanted to keep every word alive. When weather allowed, Grace wrapped her grandfather in layers of scarves and led him to the lake. Together they listened to its voice, the groan of ice, the sigh of shifting water, the thunder of cracks deep beneath the surface. To them, it was music, a language without words. One evening, as they sat on their usual bench, Samuel spoke of something he rarely mentioned. "Do you know why I didn't walk away that night?" Grace looked at him, startled. He hardly ever spoke of the night he found them as babies. "Because you were afraid?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, because I had already given up. My wife was gone. My son, too. I had nothing left. That night I was ready to end it all. And then I opened that shed and found you. 2 tiny sparks of life. It wasn't me who saved you, Grace. It was you who saved me." Grace lowered her gaze, her hands gripping the bench. "You gave us everything, Grandpa. You were our world." He smiled faintly. "And you gave me a reason to keep living." They lingered there until the sky turned violet. When they returned home, Samuel sank into his chair by the stove and drifted into sleep. Grace didn't wake him. She tucked a blanket around his shoulders and sat quietly beside him. Sometime in the night, a soft knock came at the door. Grace rose and opened it. There stood Steve, bearded, weary, but alive. He stood at the doorway with a small bag in his hands. Trying to smile, though his lips trembled, Grace embraced him without a word. Holding on for a long time, that night passed in silence. In the morning, when Samuel opened his eyes, he saw Steve in the kitchen making tea. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he simply said, "I knew it." "I'm home, Grandpa," Steve replied. Nothing else was asked. Where he had gone, what he had endured, no longer mattered. What mattered was his return. His presence. From that moment, a new chapter began. Steve threw himself into the rhythm of village life. At first, he offered help wherever it was needed. Repairing fences, fixing tools, carrying loads for the elderly. Soon, he found steady work at the workshop. People came to know him not as the boy from Washington, not as a symbol of some distant struggle, but as a man, steady, hardworking, honest. Slowly, the community embraced him as one of their own. Weeks later, the three of them walked once more to the lakeshore. The snow was melting. The air carried the first hints of spring. Samuel gazed out over Lake Michigan, then turned to his grandchildren. His voice was quiet, almost carried away by the breeze. "Can I leave in peace now? You know who you are, and you know who I am." Steve took his hand. Grace clasped the other. "You are our home," she whispered, and in that moment, everything became clear. Blood was not the true measure of family. What mattered was the one who caught you when you stumbled, the one who waited in your silence, the one who believed in you even when you doubted yourself. Bonds forged from love endure beyond time, distance, or fault. The months rolled on. Steve and Grace did more than live in Samuel's house. They guarded it like a sanctuary. Steve repaired the roof, replaced the rotten planks in the barn, painted the shutters. Grace transformed one of the rooms into a small library. Soon, children from the village gathered there to read and listen to her stories. About the lake, the old fisherman, and the man who had once saved 2 infants. Once again, the house echoed with laughter, sometimes soft, sometimes bright. Samuel rarely rose from his chair now. Breathing was difficult. His hands shook even when holding a spoon. Yet he never complained. His dignity remained untouched. He spoke little, but each word he offered carried weight, becoming a kind of anchor in the hearts of his grandchildren. More than his lessons, it was his way of being that taught them how to live. Every morning, Grace combed his hair, brought him breakfast, and read aloud to him. Sometimes fishing tales, sometimes articles from the paper. Samuel would listen, smile faintly, and close his eyes. He hardly slept at night anymore, but he never admitted to being tired. In the evenings, Steve strummed an old guitar he had found in the attic. Together they sat by the stove, just as they had in childhood. But Samuel's body was wearing out. He often sat in silence, staring at a single point as though he were already half in another world. One afternoon, he called Steve to his side and handed him a small wooden box. "When I'm gone," he said, "open this." Looking at them sitting together, Steve understood what Samuel already knew. The end of his journey was near. Many people spend their lives chasing treasure, trying to build legacies. Samuel's legacy was simpler and greater. It was the choice his grandchildren carried in their hearts. Long after his body rested by the shore, that choice would remain. Steve wanted to protest, to insist there was still time. But his grandfather's eyes held no fear, no sorrow, only peace. A few days later, Samuel slipped away in his sleep, gently, without pain, like one who has finished his task. The house was not filled with loud grief, but with a deep, solemn silence. Grace and Steve washed his body, dressed him in the old holiday shirt he had kept carefully folded, and laid him in the coffin Steve had built the winter before. Knowing this day would come, The funeral was modest, yet the whole village came. The elders stood silently. The young clasped hands. The children did not understand why the grown-ups spoke so softly. Few words were spoken about Samuel, but none were needed. His life had been testimony enough. He was buried on the shore of Lake Michigan, where he had always felt most at home. The ground was frozen, but Steve dug with his own hands, unwilling to let anyone else perform that final act of love. When the earth was finally closed, the house stood silent once more. Even the wind seemed to pass by without lingering. That night, Steve sat at the table with the wooden box before him. Slowly, he opened it. Inside lay a rolled-up letter. The handwriting unmistakably Samuel's. "Steve, Grace," it began. "I never believed I would reach old age. I thought I would go quickly, like those I loved before me. But God gave me you. You were not an accident, you were an answer. When I found you in that boat, I didn't ask questions. I only knew that suddenly there was a reason to live. I had no guide, no training, only my hands, my heart, and the lake. I made mistakes. Not always gentle, not always just, but always with love. I watched you grow into yourselves. Different from each other, different from me, but true. When Steve left, I knew he would come back. Not because this village is better than the city, but because family is not a place, it is a choice. You chose me, and I chose you. That is my greatest achievement. My legacy is not money or houses. It is this truth: love chosen freely is stronger than any bloodline. Take care of each other. Do not let the world destroy what was not built of blood, but of soul. Your grandfather." Steve read the letter aloud. Grace listened. Tears streamed down her face. They stood together in silence, and within that silence was strength. The following year, the wooden house by the lake was no longer a dwelling of loneliness, but a beacon. It welcomed villagers, travelers, and lost souls seeking something greater than themselves. Grace had turned one corner into a living memory, not a museum of objects, but of stories. And in every corner, Samuel's presence lingered, not as sorrow, but as light. This is not just the story of a fisherman. It is the story of a man who stood in the middle of life's darkest storm and chose light. Samuel's legacy was never in the tools of his trade, or the photographs that time has faded. His true inheritance was a choice, a lesson carved into the very souls of those who knew him. When the world tells you to surrender, listen instead to the quiet whisper within. Keep going, because courage is not always loud. Sometimes, it is as simple as taking one more step when everything in you wants to stop. Samuel did more than pull two children from the sea. In choosing love over despair, he saved himself. And in that choice, he set a fire burning, one that warmed not just his family, but an entire community. What did he truly accomplish? Something profound. He loved without conditions. And that love changed everything. And maybe it can change you too. If this story touched you, carry it forward. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs hope. And tell us in the comments what legacy you wish to leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe. Our next journey awaits.